This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. Loneliness is not what we think it is. I want to start somewhere uncomfortable, not with advice, not with solutions, but with a truth that tends to land like a quiet shock when I finally let it sink in. Loneliness does not look the way we were taught it would. If you had asked me years ago what loneliness was, I would have described an image: an empty apartment, a phone that never rings, weekends with no plans, and holidays spent alone. That version of loneliness made sense to me. It felt logical, almost measurable. But that wasn't my life. My life looked full, respectable, functional. I showed up to work. I returned messages. I remembered birthdays. I kept things moving. I sat at dinner tables. I stood in crowded rooms. I laughed at the right moments. And yet, there were nights when I drove home and felt something hollow settle into my chest. Not sadness exactly, not despair. Something quieter, something harder to name. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt uninhabited. That's the kind of loneliness no one warns you about. The loneliness that shows up when everything is technically fine. It's the loneliness of being surrounded and still feeling emotionally untouched. The loneliness of being capable, reliable, and invisible at the same time. The loneliness of realizing that people know your role in their lives, but not your inner life. And what made it worse was the shame. Because when your life looks good, loneliness feels like a personal failure. I told myself I had no right to feel this way. I minimized it, rationalized it, compared myself to people who had it harder. I tried to be grateful instead of honest. But loneliness doesn't disappear when I silence it. It waits. What I didn't understand back then, and what changed everything once I did, is this: loneliness is not about being alone, it's about being unseen. It's about living in a life where I am constantly present for others, but rarely present with myself, where I perform connection without actually experiencing it, where conversations skim the surface while something in me quietly sinks. There's a specific kind of loneliness that tends to find women in midlife. It doesn't arrive dramatically, it doesn't blow things up. It slips in quietly between responsibilities. It shows up when the house is finally quiet, when the kids don't need you the way they used to, when your work no longer defines you, but nothing else quite does either. It's the loneliness of transition without language, of being between versions of yourself. And because it's not loud, it's often misunderstood. People assume loneliness means lack of love, lack of friends, lack of belonging. But what I've learned is that loneliness can exist right in the middle of abundance. I can be loved and still feel lonely. I can be needed and still feel lonely. I can be admired and still feel lonely. Because loneliness isn't asking for more people, it's asking for more truth. It's asking, where did you go? Somewhere along the way, I learned to be efficient instead of expressive, composed instead of curious, helpful instead of honest. I learned how to manage life, but not how to stay inside it. So loneliness became the background noise of my days, not loud enough to demand attention, just constant enough to drain me slowly. I felt it while folding laundry on a Sunday afternoon, while standing in line at the grocery store, watching strangers choose produce like it mattered, while sitting across from people I loved, feeling like there was no space for what was actually true. And the most confusing part? I didn't want to be rescued. I didn't want to be fixed. I didn't even necessarily want to talk about it. I just wanted to feel like I existed fully, honestly, without editing. That's when I started to understand something important. Loneliness is not a problem to solve. It's a signal to listen. It's what happens when my outer life keeps going, but my inner life has been left behind. Loneliness is the cost of living on autopilot for too long. And here's the part no one really says out loud. Loneliness doesn't mean my life is wrong. It means something in me has been waiting, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be included, waiting to be lived from the inside out again. That realization didn't cure anything overnight, but it changed the way I related to loneliness. I stopped treating it like an enemy. I stopped trying to drown it out with busyness or noise or forced positivity. Instead, I started asking a different question. What am I disconnected from? Not who. What? What truth haven't I said yet? What part of myself have I been managing instead of meeting? What feeling have I labeled as inconvenient? Loneliness, I've learned, isn't the absence of connection. It's the absence of resonance. And resonance doesn't come from more people. It comes from being real enough to be felt by myself first. If anything I've said so far feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know something. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not failing at life. You are not ungrateful. You are not broken. You are paying attention, and that matters. If this way of talking about loneliness feels different, quieter, deeper, more honest, then this channel might be a place for you. So, if you're still here and something in you feels seen for the first time in a while, I invite you to subscribe. Not because this channel will fix you, but because it will sit with you. And sometimes that's where everything begins. The quiet myths that keep me lonely. There are myths that shout, and then there are myths that whisper so softly I mistake them for my own thoughts. The loud myths are easy to reject. The quiet ones are the ones that keep me lonely. For a long time, I didn't know I was living inside them. I thought I was just being realistic, practical, mature. I thought I had simply accepted how life works. But acceptance and resignation can look dangerously similar. One of the quietest myths I carried was this: if I had more people, I wouldn't feel this way. It sounds reasonable, almost obvious. So when loneliness surfaced, my first instinct was to expand outward. More invitations, more conversations, more social effort. I told myself I just needed to stay connected. I said yes when my body wanted to say no. I stayed longer than I felt present. I filled my calendar like it was proof of something. And the strangest part? The more people I was around, the lonelier I felt afterward. Because what I was really doing wasn't building connection. I was avoiding a deeper question. I was using proximity as a substitute for intimacy. That myth taught me to confuse activity with belonging. Another myth lived right beside it. Loneliness means something is wrong with me. This one is especially heavy for women who learned early how to be capable. I learned how to manage myself, how to regulate my emotions quietly, how to not be too much. I learned that being strong meant not needing too much space, too much reassurance, too much attention. I learned that independence was safety. So when loneliness showed up, I turned inward with judgment instead of curiosity. I told myself I was failing some invisible test of adulthood, that by this age, I should have figured it out, that other people seemed content, settled, rooted, and I was somehow defective for feeling unsettled. This myth didn't just make me lonely, it made me harsh. It taught me to criticize myself for having emotional depth instead of honoring it. There is also a myth that hides behind responsibility. Strong women don't feel lonely. Strong women cope. Strong women adapt. Strong women keep going. So, I kept going. I handled what needed to be handled. I showed up where I was needed. I stayed composed. I was reliable. I became the person others leaned on. And quietly, invisibly, I began to disappear from my own life. This myth taught me that strength meant self erasure, that if I was lonely, it must mean I wasn't grateful enough, or busy enough, or resilient enough. I mistook endurance for fulfillment. Another myth that shaped my loneliness was this: once things settle down, this feeling will go away. I told myself it was temporary, after the kids grow up, after the relationship stabilizes or ends, after work becomes less demanding, after the next chapter begins. I treated loneliness like a phase instead of a message. But loneliness doesn't wait politely for life to calm down. It often appears precisely when life looks stable from the outside, when the structure is there, but the meaning has shifted. This myth kept me waiting instead of listening, waiting for a future version of myself who would finally feel at home. And then there's the myth that hides in plain sight, dressed as maturity. I should be able to handle this on my own. This one is subtle. It doesn't sound cruel. It sounds responsible. I didn't want to burden anyone. I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to ask for something I couldn't clearly articulate. So I kept things light. I kept things contained. I edited my truth down to what felt acceptable. I became very good at appearing fine. But emotional self sufficiency is not the same as emotional health. This myth taught me to isolate quietly, to carry my inner life alone while appearing connected on the surface. And over time, that created a particular kind of loneliness that no amount of social interaction could touch. There is another myth that deserves naming, especially for women who have spent years being the steady one. If I've chosen this life, I'm not allowed to question it. I chose my career. I chose my relationships. I chose my responsibilities. So who was I to feel lonely? This myth told me that questioning my emotional experience meant rejecting my life. But loneliness doesn't mean I regret my choices. It means I am evolving inside them. It means something that once fit no longer does. Not because it was wrong, but because I've changed. This myth kept me loyal to versions of myself I had outgrown. What all of these myths have in common is this: they redirect my attention outward or upward or forward, anywhere but inward. They tell me to add more, do more, wait more, endure more. They never tell me to listen more. Loneliness survives when I believe these myths because they prevent me from asking the most honest questions. What do I actually need right now? What am I no longer willing to pretend about? Where am I asking myself to be smaller than I am? These myths are not cruel. They are inherited. They come from a culture that praises independence but struggles with intimacy. From a world that rewards productivity more than presence. From expectations placed on women to be emotionally competent, but quietly self contained. I didn't choose these myths consciously, but I can question them now. And questioning them doesn't make my life fall apart, it makes it more truthful. When I loosen my grip on these myths, loneliness doesn't vanish, but it changes shape. It becomes less of a verdict and more of an invitation. An invitation to stop proving that I'm fine. An invitation to stop earning my place. an invitation to stop confusing strength with silence. Loneliness doesn't mean I'm lacking something everyone else has. It means I'm standing at the edge of a deeper honesty with myself first. And that honesty, as uncomfortable as it can be, is the beginning of real connection, not louder connection, not faster connection, but truer connection, the kind that doesn't require me to disappear to belong. The real causes of loneliness that no one talks about. There is a part of loneliness that never gets named because it doesn't come from obvious places. It doesn't come from being single. It doesn't come from being unpopular. It doesn't even come from being physically alone. The real causes of loneliness are quieter than that. And because they're quiet, they're easy to miss. For a long time, I thought loneliness entered my life from the outside. I assumed it was caused by circumstances, by other people not showing up the way I hoped they would, by relationships that didn't go deep enough. But when I stopped trying to solve loneliness and started listening to it, I realized something uncomfortable. Loneliness didn't begin where people failed me. It began where I stopped staying with myself. One of the deepest causes of loneliness is emotional self abandonment. It's not dramatic. There's no moment where I consciously decide to leave myself behind. It happens slowly, through small acts of dismissal. I tell myself I'm overreacting. I minimize what I feel because it's inconvenient. I postpone grief because there's no time for it right now. I swallow disappointment because it feels childish. Over time, I become someone who manages emotions instead of experiencing them. And that's when loneliness starts to settle in. Not because no one is there for me, but because I'm no longer there for myself. Another cause of loneliness is living in a constant state of emotional usefulness. I become the listener, the reliable one, the person who knows how to hold space. People come to me when they're overwhelmed, confused, unraveling. I know how to be present for them. I ask thoughtful questions. I remember details. I make room. But when it's my turn, when something in me needs to be held, the space quietly collapses. The conversation shifts. Advice arrives too quickly. The moment passes. It's rarely intentional. Most people don't mean to overlook me. They're just not practiced at meeting depth with depth. Still, the result is the same. I learn, subconsciously, that my inner life is something I should tend to on my own. That kind of loneliness doesn't come from lack of love. It comes from lack of reciprocity. There is also a deeper layer that's harder to talk about because it reaches back further than adulthood. Many of us learned early that emotional expression came with consequences. Maybe our feelings were ignored. Maybe they were minimized. Maybe they were met with discomfort, impatience, or subtle withdrawal. So we adapted. We learned how to read rooms, how to adjust ourselves, how to stay pleasant, agreeable, manageable. We learned that being low maintenance kept relationships intact. And that learning didn't disappear when we grew up. It followed us quietly into our adult lives, shaping how we connect, how we speak, how much of ourselves we reveal. Loneliness grows when authenticity feels risky, when being fully myself feels like something I need to earn instead of something I'm allowed. Another cause of loneliness is emotional fragmentation. I show different parts of myself to different people. One version of me at work, another with family, another with friends. Each version is real, but none of them are whole. And when no single space holds the full truth of who I am, I start to feel scattered, divided, unknown. It's exhausting to live this way. Not because I'm hiding something, but because I'm constantly editing. Loneliness thrives in that fragmentation. Then there's the kind of loneliness that comes from staying too long in environments that no longer fit. This one is especially painful because it requires honesty without blame. I can love people and still outgrow the way we relate. I can be grateful for what a space once gave me and still recognize that it now leaves me feeling unseen. But acknowledging that feels disloyal. So I stay. I adjust. I shrink my expectations. And slowly, I internalize the belief that my need for depth is the problem. That belief is lonely. Another cause that rarely gets named is cumulative emotional neglect, not from one source, but from many small moments. It's not one conversation that goes wrong, it's dozens that never quite land. It's not one relationship that fails, it's years of being partially met. Loneliness accumulates when my emotional needs are consistently deferred. By others, yes, but also by me. And finally, there is a cause that feels almost counterintuitive. Loneliness can come from competence. When I'm good at coping, people assume I don't need much. When I'm emotionally articulate, they assume I've got it handled. When I'm stable, they stop checking in. And I don't correct them because I don't want to seem needy, because I don't want to disrupt the image, because I don't want to explain a feeling I barely understand myself. So, I carry it quietly. What all of these causes have in common is not absence, it's misalignment between what I feel and what I express, between what I need and what I allow myself to ask for, between who I am internally and how I show up externally. Loneliness isn't created by one missing person. It's created by thousands of moments where I didn't feel fully met and where I didn't fully meet myself either. And this is where the conversation usually goes wrong. People want to jump straight to solutions, to connection strategies, to action. But understanding the causes matters. Not so I can blame myself, but so I can stop misunderstanding myself. Loneliness isn't proof that I'm failing at relationships. It's evidence that my inner world is asking for more honesty than I've been giving it. It's asking me to stop functioning and start inhabiting my life again. Not louder, not busier, but truer. Because the real causes of loneliness don't disappear when I add more people. They soften when I stop leaving myself behind. Why being around people sometimes makes it worse. There was a time when I believed the cure for loneliness was simple: be around people. So when the ache showed up, I responded the way I'd been taught to respond. I accepted invitations. I filled my calendar. I showed up to gatherings even when my body felt heavy about it. I told myself that isolation was the enemy and proximity was the answer. What I didn't expect was this. Some of my loneliest moments happened in rooms full of people. It's a specific kind of loneliness, the kind that doesn't come from absence, but from contrast. The kind that sharpens when laughter is happening around me, when conversations are flowing easily, when everyone seems comfortably inside the moment except me. I sit there smiling, nodding, contributing just enough to appear engaged, while something inside me slowly withdraws. It feels worse than being alone, because when I'm alone, the quiet makes sense. When I'm with people and still feel disconnected, I start questioning myself. What's wrong with me? Why can't I relax? Why don't I feel what I'm supposed to feel right now? This loneliness doesn't ask for attention, it asks for honesty. Being around people can make loneliness worse when the connection stays on the surface. Small talk isn't inherently bad, it has its place. But when my life has moved into deeper questions about meaning, identity, loss, change, surface level interaction can feel like trying to breathe through a straw. I leave these interactions feeling drained, not because I dislike people, but because I had to leave parts of myself at the door. Over time, I started noticing a pattern. It wasn't that I needed fewer people, it was that I needed different kinds of presence. There is a difference between being included and being known. In many rooms, I was welcomed, I was liked, I was familiar, but I wasn't met. And being tolerated without being truly engaged creates a quiet erosion of the self. Another reason being around people can intensify loneliness is emotional mismatch. Sometimes the environment simply isn't capable of holding the version of me that's emerging. I might be in a season of reflection while the room is built for distraction. I might be grieving something invisible while everyone else is celebrating something external. I might be craving depth in a space designed for performance, and no one is wrong for that. But staying too long in spaces that don't match my internal landscape teaches me to contort myself. I become quieter. I simplify what I say. I edit what I feel. And each edit costs me a little bit of presence. Loneliness grows when I repeatedly choose belonging over authenticity. There's also the loneliness that comes from unspoken roles. In many social settings, I unconsciously step into familiar positions: the listener, the stabilizer, the agreeable one. I keep conversations moving. I make things comfortable. But comfort isn't connection. And when I am always managing the emotional temperature of the room, there is no space left for my own interior world to breathe. This kind of loneliness is exhausting because it masquerades as social success. People enjoy my company. They feel supported. They feel heard. I go home feeling empty. Another layer that makes being around people painful is comparison. Not the obvious kind, the kind that screams inadequacy, but the quieter kind that whispers dislocation. I watch others talk easily about their lives, their certainty, their sense of place. I wonder why their lives seem to fit them more naturally than mine fits me. Even if that story isn't true, the feeling lingers. Loneliness deepens when I start believing that everyone else received a manual for living that I somehow missed. And then there's the grief of outgrowing spaces that once felt like home. This grief is rarely acknowledged because it doesn't come with a clear ending or a dramatic break. There's no conflict to point to, no one to blame. Just a slow realization that something no longer nourishes me the way it used to. I might still love the people. I might still appreciate the memories. I might still show up out of habit or loyalty. But something essential is missing. Staying in those spaces doesn't just maintain loneliness, it teaches me to doubt my own needs. I tell myself I'm asking for too much. That depth is unrealistic. That this is just how adulthood works. But that belief doesn't bring peace, it brings resignation. And resignation is fertile ground for loneliness. There is also the loneliness that comes from emotional timing. Sometimes I am simply ahead of the room. Not better, not wiser, just earlier in a particular internal shift. I might be questioning things others aren't ready to question yet. I might be shedding identities others are still invested in. I might be slowing down in a culture that rewards speed. In those moments, being around people can feel alienating, not because I don't belong, but because I no longer belong there. And that distinction matters. Loneliness is not always asking me to connect harder. Sometimes it's asking me to listen more closely to where I no longer fit. Another painful truth I had to face is this. Sometimes I use being around people to avoid being with myself. I stay busy socially because silence feels confronting. I prefer noise to stillness. I choose company over honesty. But when the distraction fades, when the drive home begins, when the door closes behind me, the loneliness rushes back stronger. Not because people failed me, but because I was using them as a buffer instead of a bridge. Being around people makes loneliness worse when I'm asking connection to do the work only self presence can do. This realization wasn't comfortable. It forced me to admit that not all loneliness is solved by adding others. Some loneliness is asking me to subtract, to leave spaces that drain me, to step back from conversations that keep me small, to choose quality over familiarity. That choice comes with fear, because leaving known rooms, even lonely ones, means stepping into uncertainty. It means trusting that there are places where I don't have to explain myself down to something digestible. It means believing that connection doesn't have to cost me my wholeness. Being around people doesn't automatically heal loneliness. Sometimes it exposes it. And exposure, as uncomfortable as it is not cruelty. It's clarity. Loneliness sharpens in the wrong rooms, not to punish me, but to redirect me. Not toward isolation, toward alignment, toward spaces where I don't have to disappear to belong, toward conversations that don't require armor, toward presence that feels mutual, not managed. Understanding this didn't make loneliness vanish, but it did give it meaning. And meaning, even before comfort, changes everything. Aloneness, the skill. I was never taught. I was never taught how to be alone. Not really. I was taught how to be independent, how to take care of myself, how to not rely too much on anyone, how to stay productive, useful, composed. I was taught how to fill time, how to optimize it, how to make sure it never went to waste. But no one taught me how to be with myself when there was nothing to prove. So when I found myself alone, truly alone without obligations or noise, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt uncomfortable, exposed, almost wrong. Aloneness, to me, used to feel like something to escape. I didn't recognize it as a skill. I saw it as a gap, a failure of scheduling, a sign that something was missing. So I filled it. I filled silence with screens. I filled evenings with background noise. I filled weekends with errands I didn't need to run and tasks that didn't matter. I told myself I was relaxing, but I was really distracting myself because stillness asked questions I didn't know how to answer. What are you feeling right now? What do you want without anyone else in mind? Who are you when no one is watching? Those questions felt dangerous, indulgent, unnecessary. I didn't realize then that I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of meeting myself without an audience. Aloneness had been framed to me as something sad, something temporary, something to endure until life resumed. I had absorbed the idea that being alone meant I was waiting for people, for purpose, for something to begin. But solitude isn't waiting, it's arriving. I didn't understand that until much later, when loneliness had exhausted me enough to make escape less appealing than honesty. At first, aloneness felt awkward, even physically uncomfortable. I didn't know where to put my attention when it wasn't being pulled outward. My mind reached for stimulation automatically, like a reflex. I would sit down with the intention to rest and find myself reaching for my phone without thinking. Not because I needed information, but because I needed distance from myself. That was a hard realization. I wasn't avoiding boredom, I was avoiding presence. Being alone without distraction exposed how rarely I let myself exist without an agenda. Every moment had to justify itself. Every hour had to be useful. Even rest had to be productive. Aloneness threatened that system because in solitude, there is no performance, no role to play, no one to manage. Just me. And that felt strangely unfamiliar. What I didn't realize was that loneliness had been growing not because I was alone too often, but because I was never truly with myself when I was. There's a difference between physical aloneness and emotional presence. I could spend an entire day by myself and still not be present, still be consumed by other people's needs, expectations, opinions, still be mentally elsewhere. True aloneness requires something more demanding: attention. Attention without judgment, without fixing, without rushing to make meaning. That kind of attention felt radical to me when I finally started practicing aloneness, not as isolation, but as companionship with myself. It didn't feel immediately comforting. It felt raw. Without distractions, I noticed how much grief I had been carrying quietly. How many small disappointments I had never fully felt. How many parts of myself I had been managing instead of listening to. Solitude didn't create those feelings. It revealed them. And that's why so many of us avoid it. We live in a culture that treats silence like a problem to solve, that fills every gap with content, that equates stillness with stagnation. Especially for women, aloneness is often misunderstood. If we choose it, we're seen as withdrawing. If we enjoy it, we're seen as detached. If we prioritize it, we're seen as selfish. So, we learn to justify it or avoid it entirely. But aloneness isn't a rejection of others. It's a relationship with myself. And like any relationship, it needs time, patience, and honesty. I began to notice that when I allowed myself quiet time without an agenda, something softened, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. I started to sense myself again, not as a problem to solve, but as a presence. I noticed what calmed me, what unsettled me, what felt nourishing, what felt draining. I stopped asking how to make aloneness productive and started asking how to make it truthful. Sometimes that meant sitting with discomfort, letting boredom exist without fixing it, allowing rest to be unstructured and imperfect. Other times, it meant doing simple things slowly, walking without tracking steps, drinking coffee without multitasking, sitting by a window without thinking I should be somewhere else. These moments didn't look impressive, but they felt grounding. Loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but it lost its sharpness because I was no longer abandoning myself the moment things went quiet. There's something deeply stabilizing about knowing I can be with myself without needing escape. Not in a self sufficient, armored way, but in a gentle, companionable way. I stopped seeing aloneness as evidence of lack and started seeing it as capacity to listen, capacity to feel, capacity to notice. And that changed how I moved through the world. When I became more practiced at aloneness, I stopped using people to regulate my inner state. I no longer needed constant interaction to feel anchored. I didn't approach connection from hunger or urgency. I approached it from fullness, not abundance, not happiness, just presence. And presence makes a difference. Because when I am comfortable with myself, I am less likely to tolerate spaces that require me to disappear, less likely to accept connection that feels performative, less likely to mistake attention for intimacy. Aloneness taught me discernment. It taught me that loneliness isn't cured by noise, it's softened by honesty. And honesty begins in quiet. I don't romanticize solitude. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes it's confronting. Sometimes it's boring. Sometimes it brings up things I'd rather avoid. But it's real. And reality, even when it's uncomfortable, is less lonely than pretense. I was never taught this skill. I learned it slowly, imperfectly, by staying when I wanted to flee, by choosing presence over distraction, by letting myself exist without justification. Aloneness didn't isolate me. It introduced me back to myself. And once I was no longer a stranger to myself, loneliness had far less power over me. Not because I needed less connection, but because I finally had somewhere to come home to. Real solutions that don't involve reinventing my life. For a long time, I thought the word solution meant upheaval. It meant changing everything. It meant becoming someone else. It meant a dramatic before and after story that proved I had finally figured it out. So when loneliness stayed with me year after year, I assumed I hadn't gone far enough yet. I hadn't reinvented myself properly. I hadn't found the right lifestyle, the right routine, the right version of me. That belief alone kept me exhausted. What I eventually learned, slowly, reluctantly, is that real solutions rarely announce themselves as solutions. They don't feel bold, they don't look impressive, and they don't require me to burn my life down and rebuild it from scratch. The real solutions were quieter than my expectations. They didn't ask me to become more confident, more social, or more fulfilled. They asked me to become more honest. One of the first shifts that mattered was letting go of the idea that loneliness was something to fix. Fixing implies urgency. Fixing implies deficiency. Fixing implies that where I am is unacceptable. But loneliness didn't need fixing. It needed safety. I began to notice how unsafe my inner world often felt. Not because anything terrible was happening, but because I was constantly evaluating myself. Am I doing enough? Am I behind? Am I wasting time? Am I missing something? That internal pressure made even rest feel tense. So instead of trying to improve myself, I focused on something far less glamorous, creating internal safety. Safety meant I stopped demanding clarity from myself all the time. It meant allowing uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. It meant letting questions exist without immediately turning them into plans. That alone softened something in me. Another real solution was learning to stop treating my inner life like a project. I had spent years consuming language about growth, healing, optimization. Even when it sounded gentle, it carried an implicit message. You are not enough yet. Loneliness feeds on that message. So I stepped back from trying to become better and started asking how to become more present. Presence looks ordinary. It looks like noticing when my body is tired instead of pushing through. It looks like acknowledging disappointment instead of reframing it immediately. It looks like admitting that something matters to me, even if I don't know what to do about it yet. Presence doesn't solve loneliness instantly, but it interrupts it because loneliness thrives in disconnection from the present moment. I also stopped searching for solutions that depended on motivation. Motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes. It rises when things feel exciting and disappears when life feels heavy. I didn't need motivation. I needed permission. Permission to live my life at the pace it actually wanted to move. One of the most practical changes I made was allowing myself to create small, non negotiable rituals that had nothing to do with productivity or self improvement. Not habits, not routines designed to make me better. Rituals that made me feel here. Simple things: walking the same route at dusk without listening to anything, sitting with a cup of coffee in the morning without checking messages, lighting a candle at night not to mark productivity, but to mark transition. These moments didn't cure loneliness, but they grounded me. They gave my days edges, texture, a sense of inhabiting my own life instead of rushing through it. Another real solution was learning to trust subtle discomfort instead of overriding it. Loneliness often sharpened when I ignored my own signals, when I stayed in conversations that felt draining, when I agreed to things out of obligation, when I kept myself busy to avoid disappointing someone. I began paying attention to the quiet resistance in my body, not as a command, but as information. When I honored those signals, even imperfectly, loneliness lost some of its grip because I was no longer betraying myself for the sake of harmony. I also stopped looking for solutions that depended on other people changing. That was a hard one. It meant accepting that some relationships might never go deeper, that some people loved me in the way they were capable of, and that capacity had limits. Acceptance didn't mean withdrawal, it meant realism without bitterness. I stopped trying to extract intimacy from places that weren't designed to hold it. That freed up energy I didn't realize I had been spending. Another shift that mattered was redefining what connection was allowed to look like. I had internalized the idea that connection needed to be consistent, frequent, and emotionally intense to count. But real connection can be intermittent, quiet, unremarkable on the surface. Sometimes it's one honest conversation every few months. Sometimes it's a shared silence that doesn't need explanation. Sometimes it's knowing someone is there without constant proof. Letting connection be smaller and truer made loneliness less dramatic. I also had to confront how often I treated my feelings as inconveniences. Loneliness was often layered with grief, envy, longing, and fear. I wanted to resolve those emotions quickly so I could move on. But emotions don't respond to efficiency. So instead of asking how to get rid of them, I practiced staying with discomfort without narrating it, staying with longing without turning it into comparison, staying with sadness without labeling it as a problem. That staying built trust with myself. And trust is one of the most underrated antidotes to loneliness. Because when I trust myself, I don't feel as desperate to be anchored by others. Another real solution was allowing my life to be quieter, without assuming that meant it was smaller. Quiet lives are often mislabeled as empty lives, but quiet can be spacious. Quiet can be intentional. Quiet can be deeply alive. I stopped measuring my life by how much it impressed others and started measuring it by how it felt to live inside. That shift didn't make my life glamorous, it made it sustainable. And sustainability matters more than intensity. Perhaps the most important real solution was this: I stopped waiting to feel different before living differently. I didn't wait to feel confident to set boundaries. I didn't wait to feel inspired to simplify my days. I didn't wait to feel certain before making small adjustments. I moved gently, even while unsure. And in doing so, I discovered something unexpected. Loneliness didn't disappear because I solved it. It softened because I stopped fighting it. I stopped treating it like a verdict on my life and started seeing it as feedback. Feedback that I needed less noise, less performance, less proving, and more truth. The real solutions didn't reinvent my life. They helped me inhabit it. Not as a finished version, not as an optimized one, but as a real one. And that, quietly, made all the difference. Letting connection be slow. Again, at some point, without realizing it, I began to rush connection. Not because I was impatient by nature, but because I was tired of feeling unmoored. I wanted certainty. I wanted to know where I stood with people. I wanted to feel anchored again. So, when I met someone new, or when an old relationship showed signs of depth, I leaned in quickly. I shared more than I was ready to hold. I tried to accelerate intimacy, hoping it would quiet the loneliness I carried. It rarely worked. What I eventually had to accept is something no one prepares us for. Connection in adulthood is slower, not weaker, not less meaningful, just slower. And resisting that slowness was costing me more than I realized. When we're younger, connection is built into the structure of life. School, proximity, shared milestones. Time does a lot of the work for us. Friendships form because we're simply there together, often enough without having to plan it. As adults, especially in midlife, that structure disappears. People are busy, lives are layered, energy is finite. Connection no longer happens by default. It happens by choice. And choice takes time. I had to unlearn the idea that real connection should feel immediate. That belief had been shaped by a culture that rewards speed, instant chemistry, immediate openness, quick emotional access. But depth doesn't grow on a deadline. When I tried to rush connection, I often ended up feeling more alone. Not because people rejected me, but because the pace wasn't honest. I was trying to skip the part where trust forms quietly. I started noticing that the connections that lasted, the ones that didn't leave me feeling hollow afterward, had something in common. They unfolded slowly. They didn't demand constant contact. They didn't require immediate vulnerability. They allowed space between interactions without anxiety. Slowness created safety. When connection moves slowly, there's room to notice how I feel in it. Do I feel more like myself or less? Do I feel curious or tense? Do I feel expanded or monitored? These are questions I can't answer when everything is moving too fast. Letting connection be slow also required me to tolerate uncertainty. I had to sit with not knowing exactly what a relationship was becoming. I had to resist the urge to define it too early, label it, secure it. That was uncomfortable. Because uncertainty can feel like rejection when I'm already sensitive to loneliness. But certainty isn't the same as connection. Sometimes it's just control. I also had to accept that not every connection is meant to go deep. This was difficult because I had learned to measure connection by intensity. If it didn't become meaningful quickly, I assumed it wasn't real. If it stayed light, I dismissed it as shallow. But there is value in gentle connections, in familiarity without expectation, in conversations that don't carry the weight of emotional disclosure. Not every relationship needs to carry my inner world. Letting connection be slow meant letting it be what it is, not what I need it to become to soothe my loneliness. Another shift was learning to stop over explaining myself. When I felt unsure, I tended to talk more, clarify more, reveal more. I thought transparency would bring closeness. Sometimes it did. Often it overwhelmed the space. Slowness taught me that presence matters more than disclosure, that listening can be a form of intimacy, that shared experience can build trust without words. I didn't need to be fully known all at once. I needed to be met gradually. Letting connection be slow also meant redefining success. I stopped measuring relationships by frequency of contact or emotional intensity. I started paying attention to how I felt after interacting. Did I feel steadier or depleted? Did I feel more like myself or more edited? These questions became more important than labels. Slowness also helped me recognize when a connection wasn't aligned. When things moved too fast, I sometimes ignored discomfort because I was afraid to lose momentum. I didn't want to go back to feeling alone. But loneliness inside a misaligned connection is heavier than loneliness alone. Allowing space gave me clarity, and clarity is kinder than forcing something to work. Another aspect of slowing down was letting go of the idea that connection had to look a certain way. Not all meaningful relationships are symmetrical. Not all depth is mutual in the same moments. Not all closeness involves frequent communication. Some people are companions for a season. Some are anchors from a distance. Some are mirrors that appear briefly and leave a lasting impression. Letting connection be slow allowed me to appreciate these variations without trying to turn them into something else. I also had to confront my fear of being left. Rushing connection was often my attempt to secure it, to lock it in before it could fade. But connection that requires rushing isn't secure, it's fragile. Slowness builds resilience. It allows relationships to bend without breaking, to pause without collapsing, to change without disappearing. There is a different kind of intimacy that comes from knowing someone over time, from witnessing them in different moods, seasons, and contexts, from allowing mutual understanding to accumulate rather than explode. That kind of intimacy can't be forced. It can only be allowed. Letting connection be slow didn't eliminate loneliness, but it changed how I carried it. I stopped using relationships as proof that I wasn't alone. I stopped expecting people to resolve my inner uncertainty. Instead, connection became something I participated in, not something I consumed. And in that shift, something softened. I no longer needed to be everywhere. I no longer needed to be deeply connected to everyone. I no longer needed to rush toward belonging. I trusted that belonging would emerge in the right places, at the right pace. Letting connection be slow taught me patience, not as endurance, but as respect. Respect for my own rhythms, respect for other people's boundaries, respect for the natural timing of intimacy. And perhaps most importantly, it taught me this: I don't need to chase connection to be worthy of it. I can let it approach me, quietly, gradually, honestly. And when it does, it feels less like relief and more like recognition. There is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when I begin to realize that the way I've been interpreting my life might be wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic sense, not mistaken in facts or choices. Wrong in meaning. For a long time, I treated this phase of my life as evidence that something had gone off track. I felt suspended between who I used to be and who I was supposed to become next, and I assumed that suspension meant failure. I told myself I was late, behind, out of sync. But what if this place I'm standing in isn't a mistake? What if it's the middle? The middle is an uncomfortable place because it doesn't offer clear identities. It doesn't come with applause or instructions. It doesn't give me a role that others immediately recognize. In the middle, old motivations stop working. Old definitions of success feel hollow. Old ways of connecting no longer satisfy. And because nothing has fully replaced them yet, the space feels empty. I mistook that emptiness for brokenness. I looked at my life and wondered why the things that once sustained me no longer did. Why the structures I had built felt too tight. Why the goals I had achieved didn't bring the sense of arrival I expected. I asked myself what was wrong with me. But the middle isn't a malfunction, it's a transition. It's the space where the old self has loosened its grip, but the next self hasn't fully formed yet. Of course, it feels disorienting. We live in a culture that only knows how to narrate beginnings and endings. We celebrate becoming and arriving. We understand breakdowns and breakthroughs, but we don't know how to sit with in between states. So, when I found myself here, functional but restless, capable but quietly lost, I assumed I needed to fix something. I didn't. I needed to listen. The middle is where questions replace answers. Questions like, what actually matters to me now? What am I no longer willing to pretend about? What kind of life do I want to live from the inside? These questions don't come with immediate clarity. They come with uncertainty, pauses, and discomfort. And that discomfort is often labeled as loneliness. But loneliness in this context isn't a sign that I'm failing at life. It's a sign that my inner world is reorganizing. I began to see that the loneliness I felt wasn't asking me to go back or rush forward. It was asking me to stay with myself long enough to notice what was shifting, to stay without numbing, without rushing to conclusions, without demanding answers before they were ready to emerge. That kind of staying is not passive. It's one of the most honest things I've ever done. In the middle, I no longer get to rely on momentum. I have to choose presence deliberately. I have to meet myself without the familiar props of identity or certainty. And that can feel frightening because when I stop defining myself by roles, caretaker, professional, partner, achiever, I'm left with something quieter and less structured. Just me. At first, that felt like loss, but over time, I realized it was space. Space to notice my actual values instead of inherited ones. Space to feel grief for lives I didn't live without turning it into regret. Space to acknowledge longings without immediately trying to satisfy them. The middle allowed me to integrate parts of myself I had previously kept separate. The younger part of me that wanted meaning, not just stability. The older part of me that valued peace more than proving anything. The part of me that was tired of striving, and the part that still wanted depth. Before, these parts felt in conflict. In the middle, they began to coexist. I stopped seeing my uncertainty as weakness. Uncertainty meant I was no longer lying to myself. It meant I was no longer forcing clarity where there wasn't any yet. And that shift changed the way I related to loneliness. Loneliness stopped feeling like a verdict on my life. It became a companion, a quiet one that walked beside me through this transition. It reminded me when I was trying to skip ahead. It nudged me when I was abandoning myself again. It softened when I stayed honest. I also began to understand something else. The middle is not meant to be optimized. There is no efficient way through it. Trying to rush the middle only deepens the sense of dislocation. It turns reflection into rumination. It turns curiosity into pressure. So I stopped asking when this phase would end and started asking how I wanted to inhabit it. Did I want to move through it with impatience or with care? Did I want to treat it as an obstacle or as a threshold? The middle asked me to slow down not because I was weak, but because something subtle was being formed. Identity isn't rebuilt in a straight line. Meaning doesn't announce itself on a schedule. Depth takes time. In the middle, I learned to release the need to explain myself to others. I stopped trying to package my experience into something easily understood. I stopped apologizing for not having a clear narrative. I'm figuring things out became enough. I also stopped measuring my life against timelines that no longer fit. The middle has its own rhythm. It doesn't respond well to comparison. It requires trust, quiet, unglamorous trust. That clarity will come, but not all at once. What surprised me most was that the middle didn't shrink my life. It expanded it. By stripping away false urgency, it gave me access to nuance, to subtle joy, to a steadier sense of self that didn't depend on external validation. I became more discerning, more patient, more grounded. Not because I tried to be, but because the middle demanded honesty over performance. And slowly, something settled. Not certainty, not resolution, but a sense of coherence. I began to feel like my life made sense again. Not because everything was clear, but because I was no longer fighting where I was. I stopped asking what was wrong with me and started recognizing what was emerging. If I could speak to myself at the beginning of this phase, I wouldn't offer reassurance or motivation. I would offer context. I would say, you are not broken. You are not late. You are not failing. You are in the middle. And the middle is not a void, it's a passage. One that asks for patience instead of pressure, presence instead of performance, honesty instead of answers. You don't need to escape it. You need to walk through it, slowly, attentively, without turning away from yourself. Because on the other side of the middle is not a better version of you, it's a truer one. And that truth is not loud. It doesn't announce itself with certainty or confidence. It arrives quietly, like recognition, like coming home. You're not broken. You're just in the middle.